Welcome back to the CaMMVets Radio Report on WVOX AM 1460 and heard around the world on WVOX.com. We have a special guest coming up on the line, but first, here's Ken.
Hey, thanks, Jack. Thanks to our team in the studio helping us today, and CaMMVetsMedia. We're very pleased to call on one of our friends who we met through the United States Military Academy, one of their graduates in the class of 1976. He's already mentoring the class of 2026, and former Vice President of the Association of the U.S. Army and the former Commanding General of the U.S. Army North, the 5th Army, which my dad served in at one time. So glad to have with us today Lieutenant General Guy Swan. Sir, how are you today?
Ken, it's always great to be with you and your listeners.
Hey, thanks so much. We appreciate it. One of your themes you've always talked to us about is the importance of armor and armor being led by tanks, and so much discussion the past week about the impact of tanks that Ukraine may be able to receive that will help in their battles against the Russians. And the United States just agreeing to send about 30 modern tanks, the Abrams tanks, the M1A1 tanks to Ukraine, and that is freeing up, encouraging Germany to send its Leopard 2 tanks, and also a number of NATO allies to provide these Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Why does all of this make a difference, do you see?
Well, tanks are going to be important when the spring counteroffensive continues with the Ukrainians. But I think we need to caution our listeners that getting these tanks to Ukraine and getting them in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers will not be an easy task. Tanks require, I grew up as a tank officer in the Army. Tanks require a lot of training and maintenance, and that was difficult enough to just work on the lone M1 tank fleet. But as we burden the Ukrainians with tanks from Germany, Britain, and the United States, just think about the logistical challenge that will create for NATO and for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been extremely resourceful, and I would not count them out. But if we're going to get these tanks in their hands, it's going to take several months to do so, Ken.
Absolutely. You know, one of the Army football players we covered for a number of years, Jabari Laws, just graduated, Army quarterback, was going to become an armor officer. How long does it take for someone, a young officer like Jabari Laws, to learn how the tank fleet works and how to lead a squadron of tanks?
Well, that's the point. We can get the individual tank in the hands of soldiers probably within a month or two, or maybe 3, to learn the fundamentals of the actual vehicle. That's difficult enough. But then the unit training so that these are employed in a meaningful manner. You've seen the Russians, how horribly they've managed this, where their individual tanks just become targets. And the only way to make these modern weapon systems work is that they must be used in a combined arms manner with artillery and infantry. Infantry protects the tanks protect the infantry. And if you don't do that, they will just end up being targets. So that unit training is also going to be time consuming, but ultimately that will lead to victory on the battlefield.
Very good. We heard Army Chief of Staff James McConville, a West Point grad, speak just on that on a conference call last week. He said, if you don't want to win, you don't need tanks. And he talked about just what you said, the importance of integrated combat warfare. Do you see the Ukrainians able to do that in the short term if they have to fend off the Russians in just a couple of months?
I think they will be able to. They have already shown great resourcefulness, great skill on the battlefield. The challenge will be numbers and how long they can sustain that equipment. I was reading an article today that the U.S. Army and the other NATO allies have set up call centers so that Ukrainian soldiers who have mechanical issues with NATO equipment can call in and get advice on how to repair their equipment, their artillery, and other pieces of equipment. It'll be interesting to see how they do that with tanks.
I'd like to have my colleague Jack McGurk talk about this did a report on 299 shells and missiles fired at Ukraine by the Russians in a single day, and that in another day, 47 of 70 missiles and drones were knocked down by the Ukrainian defense, but a number got through, doing devastating damage. Jack, ask about that.
Yeah, it was 299 rockets and artillery shells in the town of Volodar, which is 25 miles southwest of the Donetsk. Also, Russia launched 70 missiles at Ukraine Thursday, 47 of which were intercepted. And apparently 2 of them were hypersonic missiles as well. So what's your take on what Russia is doing there?
A lot of that is indiscriminate, as you have seen, and going after largely civilian and infrastructure targets. They have not been using those weapons as much to go after the Ukrainian military, which I think will come back to haunt the Russians. Terror bombing we've seen in other wars is not very effective. If anything, it hardens the resistance of those on the receiving end. So it's also depleting their stockpiles, and both sides, NATO and Russia, are going to have to deal with their defense industrial base and how quickly they can keep up with that level of expenditure.
Absolutely, and the United States is giving Army equipment, the Bradley fighting vehicles and the Stryker vehicles, as well as Patriot missiles, the HIMARS. What's making a difference in what the United States is providing Ukraine?
Well, obviously, it gives them the wherewithal to stand up to Russian equipment, which in large measure is inferior to Western equipment, both the U.S. and NATO ally equipment. It will, once the spring thaw starts to occur, they will need that mobility to deal with the Russians. As you all know, this war has kind of bogged down into almost a World War I type of scenario, which I think will be opening up as the spring comes. So it's vitally important that they have this mobility from the Bradleys and the tanks and naturally the artillery that paves the way for them.
And some of the Sunday news shows were talking yesterday is American support for Ukraine maintaining itself. There seem to be some drops or some talk in Congress with this debt ceiling limit about changes in funding. What do you feel like? Tell us why you see it's so important that the United States supports Ukraine to the end on this.
What you're getting at, Ken, is Putin is counting on the West tiring of this conflict, and that's going to be a challenge to keep the NATO alliance together in support of Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine is not part of NATO, but the aggression that Russia has shown towards Ukraine is being watched by others around the world, principally the Chinese and others. And so it's important for us to demonstrate strength with the Ukrainians, not just for the Ukrainians themselves, but for others like the Taiwanese who are watching this.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about a leader from West Point, the most recent former superintendent, now 4-star General Darrell Williams, took over in June as the commander of the United States Army in Europe, going to a very important job at a pivotal time. How is General Darrell Williams doing as commander of U.S. Army Europe?
Well, U.S. Army Europe is the focal point for the support that we're giving to the Ukrainians.
WVOX.
So whatever comes through the supply chain is going through his command.
Your show is going to
And
start
also
in
a very
about 10
important
minutes. I'm just
mission
going
he
to put
has
you on
right now
hold.
is training Ukrainian soldiers. Much of that is being done in Poland and other NATO countries,
No problem.
but some is being done in Germany as well. So he has a dual mission of supplying a lot of the equipment we've just talked about, but also a very important training mission.
Well, our best wishes to him. How do you feel NATO is doing? There were some reports and commentary out of the Davos conference last week about Finland and Sweden having their application to NATO delayed, possibly due to resistance from Turkey. How do you see NATO looking at the addition to those countries and staying together as a pivotal force?
Well, NATO has been basically inviting those countries for many, many years. They've been neutral since World War II, and now they feel threatened by what we've seen in Ukraine, and so their application is a natural thing. The Turks are kind of a prickly ally, as everybody knows. They like to play both sides against the middle. So they have off and on relations with the Russians, off and on relations with the other NATO partners. I think ultimately both of those countries will be admitted into the alliance.
And we just have about 30 seconds left. I want to ask you about something I know you enjoy doing. You're involved with the Association of Graduates at West Point, but also the 50-year class. Your class is 76 out of West Point, and you've been mentoring the freshmen who are members of 2026. How's that going?
The 50-year affiliation program is wonderful, Ken. That aligns the current plebe class with those who preceded them by 50 years, and I'm sorry to say that I'm one of them, but it's a great mentorship and partnership, and it is the epitome and personification of what we call the long gray line. Those new cadets are seeing people who preceded them and have served and have been in their shoes, and it's a lot of fun going. We will be with that class of 26 all through their cadet experience at all their milestone events.
Well, so good to talk.
It's
a great role for you. Lieutenant General Guy Swan, great American, former commander of the 5th Army, a national treasure. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks, Ken.
You've been listening to the CaMMVets Radio Report on WVOX AM 46 here around the world on WVOX.com. We thank today's special guest, Lieutenant General Guy Swan from the United States Army. Remember to check out our Facebook pages, the CaMMVets Radio Report page, our Sea Services page, our Ariana Basketball Report page, and our West Point Football Report page. And until next week, remember to thank a veteran.